that I've seen that before. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Pete Carmichael. I'm the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, and I'm with my colleague, Ashley Luskey, also of the Civil War Institute. And this afternoon, we have Gary Gallagher of the University of Virginia. You are still the now professor, but emeritus. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That is correct. And he is in his amazing, impressive library in Charlottesville. That's just a fraction. What are we looking at? Not even what?
We're looking at, what are we looking at? We're looking at 3 bookcases out of 39, that size that I have. Yeah. 39.
And what would you say?
You've loved these books more than once, Peter, and helped put some of the bookcases together at different times.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a joy. How many books roughly would you say you have?
I think I'm down maybe to about 5,000 now.
It's down to that.
It's down probably 1,500 or so.
15. Oh, wow. And a true working library.
True working library, yes.
Library as well. Yeah, good. And you can see mine, there's the difference in our personalities. Look at my shelves and how chaotic and disordered they are compared to yours. That does not surprise you, though, does it? Another look of disapproval already.
I'm smiling. It's, again, Ashley and I were talking earlier about the problems with oral history, and this is now just a problem with testimony of any kind, that you need to be very wary of how you use it. But Peter, you're in charge.
Yeah, I'm in charge. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley. We are, of course, going to talk about your recent book with LSU. And in fact, Ashley has a promo to mention that LSU is offering 40% off. Is that correct?
Yes, 40% off. This is the title. Of course, we've been marketing it, publicizing it, but it's The Enduring Civil War: Reflections on the Great American Crisis. And yes, it's a 40% promo, and I'm actually going to type in the discount code. If you go to lsupress.org and you we'll type it into the comments.
That's almost better than what you get, Dr. Gallagher, right? As an author.
That's the author's discount.
That's the author's discount. Yeah,
yep.
Very nice. Yep. Better than Amazon.
Author's discount. Amazon's offering no discount, I don't think.
Yeah, none of that makes any sense. It's very inconsistent. When it comes to these discounts by Amazon, it's just all over the place. I'm going to get us started, Dr. Gallagher, with a question that will eventually lead you to your most recent book. And the question is about the first primary source that you encountered in the Civil War. Manuscript source, I'm curious if you can recall, what was the first one you put into your hands? And manuscript source. What do you think? I can remember my first.
Boy, I think it might have been an Alexander Hamilton Stevens letter that a collection I was looking at in the 1970s when I was working on a dissertation topic that I never finished. And I went to the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York, which had a collection of Alexander H. Stevens papers for some reason. And I think that was my first researching stop. And that was probably the first thing that I looked at.
How about First Civil War?
First Civil War, boy. I looked at some miscellaneous letters that people had at the University of Texas in Austin. My major professor, Barnes Lathrop, had a few examples of primary documents. Those would have been the very first ones. The first serious ones, the first time I really immersed myself in Civil War manuscripts with the Southern Historical Collection in Chapel Hill in 1980.
When you were working on Ramsar?
When I was working on Ramsar, yeah.
So I'm going to have a quick follow-up before I let Ashley jump in here. In the book, you mentioned a conversation with your mentor, Barnes Lathrop, and he responded to, I think it was an inquiry that you had, that you thought your dissertation, your argument was going to go in a new direction, and it was maybe bothering you or you were surprised. And Lathrop said to you, listen, you just need to look at the sources, judge the sources, and work from that. So could you talk to us a little bit about your approach and those words of wisdom that Barnes Lathrop gave you?
Well, it was a little saltier than that. I wanted to write an article and thought I had a very good idea for the article, and then I started to look around at evidence and found out that my very good idea was just wrong. And I went and kind of whined to him about it, and he said, and I can quote him because it's vividly said, "God damn it, Gallagher, just go where the evidence leads and you'll be all right." And those words have never left me, and that is, I mean, that's my approach to being a historian. You can have all kinds of good ideas before you start something. Once you start looking at evidence, the only thing that is incumbent upon us to do, in my view, is play it straight with the evidence. And if the preponderance of evidence says X, even though your original idea was Y, you have to say X, because that's where the evidence took you. And if you really do go where the evidence takes you, I think you generally will be all right. Even if people disagree with you, if the evidence is on your side, over the long haul, you'll probably be just fine.
I'm not asking you to throw a historian under the bus here, but I am curious about what you mean when somebody doesn't play it straight with the evidence. Can you give us an example?
Well, I mean, okay, so go back to my notion that I have a really good idea and I want to argue this, and then I look at 100 pieces of evidence and 23 of them support the good idea I had and 77 of them don't, then my argument has to be where the 77 are, in my view. Not, I can still quote the 23 and be quoting actual sources. Anybody can go check them and see that I've quoted them accurately, and there they are. But what they don't know is that 3/4 of the things I looked at didn't sustain my argument. I just decided not to quote the 3/4 of the things that didn't sustain my argument. An excellent example of this would be, I think, and I'll go back to my LBJ library days. Bob Cairo, he's been working on Lyndon Johnson for 40 years almost now, and his books, I think, are well worth reading. But initially, he had a very firm idea of what he wanted to do with Johnson, I think, and it was very negative, and he cherry-picked evidence. Now, lots of people do that. It's not just Bob Cairo, but he was a good example, and in a couple of early graduate seminars that I taught, I would use him as an example of how not to deal with evidence. And so, I mean, there are different ways to go at it. You can either use evidence the way lawyers do, which is to exactly cherry pick evidence and only use the things. Alan Nolan and I used to talk about this. My dear friend Alan Nolan and your friend Alan Nolan. Alan was a lawyer and a very good one. And he would have an argument in mind, and then he would go find the evidence that supported it and ignore a lot of other. And I used to laugh with Alan and say, you're a perfect example of how lawyers use evidence and how historians shouldn't use evidence. And Alan would say, that's not what I do. And I said, well, of course it's what you do. You and I talk about this at every step. It's exactly what you do. It's not what I do. And anyway, but
it's exactly what Alan did. And not only Alan used hearsay time and time again.
Evidence is evidence.
Evidence is evidence, even though, of course,
Yep.
They came from questionable sources. But again, the book, Lee Considered, and it seems to me that, a book that was so important and so pivotal when I was in graduate school in the late 80s, is a book already that certainly doesn't have the attention of people as it once did. But an important book, but a book whose arguments I almost entirely disagree with, but it still is a book worth.
I mean, part of that book is right and part of that book is wrong. And it appeared in my Civil War America series at UNC Press, and Alan and I read every chapter of that multiple times, and we would have good-natured discussions about them. I mean, parts of it hold up, parts of it don't. I think it's weakest on the military things and strongest on non-military things. But I mean, the real problem with Lee Considers is it's about Lee, and Lee is kind of, I mean, I don't think that's just, the literature's moved on from then.
So Gary, that kind of brings me back to your chapter in which you wrote about your early inspiration from Potter's impending crisis and his approach to history, and how you, I think, rightly, vehemently disagree with kind of back-reading history, seeing inevitability where there is an inevitability, ignoring contingency. the tendency to read the present into the past. Can you speak to a little bit more to the audience about how Potter has influenced both the nature of how you approach historical content evident, but also the way that you write, the style of your writing?
Well, I think Potter is one of the David Potter is one of the giants in the history of American historians. He didn't live very long. He only lived to be 60 years old, which is too bad. The book that really got me on to the point you're talking about, it was about Lincoln and the Republican Party and the secession crisis. And he made a powerful argument about how you shouldn't start at the end of that story, which is there's firing on Fort Sumter, war comes, and all of this happens. You need to read forward in the evidence to understand that there isn't really inevitability at work there. A little light went on in my brain when I read that, and he talks about all the contingent things that were going on during the secession winter of 1860-61 in that book. It's a book that's still well worth reading, even though it's 80 years old now, or nearly 80 years old. The other thing by Potter that really impressed me as a graduate was, I love The Impending Crisis, which it was finished posthumously by Don Fehrenbacher, but it's his essay on nationalism, the historian's use of nationalism and vice versa, which is an awful title, but a great essay. It was also something that really impressed me, and arguing about a number of things. One being that there are almost never just clear dichotomies in history, that people have a range of influences that act upon them as they decide what to do, and we need to be aware of these complex groups of influences and attitudes that they have. But he also talked about how historians have a tendency to treat people they don't like in the past differently than people they do like in the past. And the issue he was talking about there specifically was the idea of Confederate nationalism. He wrote this originally in the mid-1960s, early 1960s, and then it was reprinted. But he said there's that if you argue that there was Confederate nationalism, people get upset because they don't like to ascribe to an overtly slave-holding republic true nationalism. And so it's just an essay that has lots of stuff in it. He's extremely careful, extremely precise with language, Potter was. Also could write narrative history very well, as The Impending Crisis shows. So I just think he's someone, I don't think anybody should be able to get out of graduate school in U.S. history without being exposed to Potter in some way.
Problem is, in graduate school seminars, for the most part, they only assign things that have been published in the last 5 to 7
years. I know. Yeah. Well, I had an interesting discussion with a group of graduate students. It's been a little more than a year ago now. We were talking about the institution of slavery, and they had never heard of Kenneth Stamp. They had never heard. They had no idea who Gene Genovese is. That, needless to say, they had never heard of American Negro slavery or life and labor in the Old South. They'd never heard of Stanley Elkins, never heard of them. And how you can pretend to be studying slavery and have no idea of how the field has evolved is mind-boggling to me. If it wasn't published after about 2005, it doesn't exist. Anyway.
Yeah. No, it's certainly a serious problem in the training of graduate students.
Serious problem.
It is. It is. There's no doubt. I want to go back to Potter real quickly and about nationalism, and then come back to the enduring Civil War. You have a few pieces in here that advance the argument that you made in Confederate War and other places about Confederate nationalism. So can you just again give us in a nutshell your take on this issue of Confederate nationalism and how we should sort of understand it within the framework of the war itself?
Well, I think, first of all, I do believe there was a strong sense of Confederate nationalism, a national sentiment, a sense of being part of a slaveholding nation among Confederates. Doesn't mean there was no anti-government sentiment in the Confederacy. Of course, there was a lot of people unhappy with what the government was doing in lots of ways. The poll question that I would like to have been able to give to white people in the Confederacy at any point in the war was, would you rather be in the Confederacy run by Jefferson Davis and people you don't like, or would you rather be under the control of Abraham Lincoln and his government. Which of those two things would you prefer? And I think the overwhelming response would have been, well, I hate Jefferson Davis. I don't like what they're doing. I don't like conscription. I don't like impressment. But under the Lincoln government, are you kidding me? They're going to destroy the whole social system that we have in the Confederacy. So I do think there was Confederate national sentiment. And I think it flowed naturally from a sense, from an identity as white Southerners before the war. There already was a sense of communal identity before the Civil War. And I think that sense of being a white Southerner easily became a sense of being a Confederate, because a lot of the same things went into those two attitudes. I don't think that's a big leap for people. And a good example of that is Robert E. Lee. He's often talked about, oh, he's just a Virginian, he's a Virginian, he's a Virginian. Well, is he a Virginian or is he American? Well, he had a U.S. identity, he had a Virginia identity. He also thought of himself as a white Southerner, and he didn't like attacks on the white South. He loathed abolitionists. He thought agitators in the North were trying to undermine the social institutions of the South. And Lee becomes an ardent Confederate. I don't think it's a stretch, but both his Virginia identity and his white Southern identity were perfectly compatible with a Confederate identity. And I don't think state identities went away, just as they didn't in the United States. But I do think there's a real sense of being Confederates. And I think part of the proof of that is it lasted for decades after the Civil War. This argument that the Confederacy only became a nation after the war, I think is let's just say I don't think it stands up or makes sense. I mean, it's a continuation. They couldn't keep what they really wanted, but they could still engage in all kinds of retrospective longings and cheering for what they had lost that they had really liked.
Go ahead.
So, and then on the other side, of course, you wrote the Union War, and you speak, at length in the enduring Civil War.
The Winners' War.
I'm sorry?
The Winners' War. There were winners too.
Yeah. You speak at length about how often the idea of union is misunderstood in the present, or at least not understood in the same way as 19th century Americans and certainly soldiers fighting for the North understood union and the powerful hold that word and that idea held upon people, and that the current occupation with race and racial justice can kind of subsume this very powerful, more powerful, I guess, in your estimation, idea that bonded people from the North together. So could you give kind of a nutshell, again, backstory about what the word and the idea of union really means? Because when I talk about this with students, and we read, in fact, a chapter from the Union War, they tend to get it maybe a quarter to a half of the way there. But again, they have difficulties really reckoning with just how powerful a hold that concept had.
I think most Americans have absolutely no concept of what union meant, and not a slight concept. None. They don't have any idea about what it means and what a hold it had on mid-19th century Americans, who it's linked exactly to the sense of exceptionalism that Americans had in the mid-19th century. They looked at their republic, and they were right in arguing that it was exceptional in a Western world of the mid-19th century. It's a place where, because of the work of the founders and the American Revolution, it's a place where citizens had a say in their own government because they could vote. We're talking about white men here. It is the mid-19th century. You have a voice in your own government, and you have the possibility of rising economically. Those are two things, they argued, that set the United States apart from everywhere else. And they believed that if you could destroy that union just because you didn't like who was elected president in 1860, as in their view, the slaveholding oligarchs were doing, then it meant the work of the founders had failed, and that every drop of blood shed in the revolution had been wasted, and that the forces of aristocracy, oligarchy, that's the word they use the most, is oligarchs and oligarchy, and monarchy would triumph. They looked to Europe. They knew that the revolutions of the late 1840s had failed in Europe. They thought Europe was going backward, not forward, in terms of small d democracy. And so they thought a very great deal was at stake, not only for Americans, but also, and here's where Lincoln's last best hope of Earth comes in, but also for the Western world, which is the world they cared about. If the Confederates succeeded, it would prove to the oligarchs of Europe that people aren't capable of self-government. They can't even disagree during a presidential election without pulling the nation apart. That's why it's important to make South Carolina, which nobody liked basically, to come back into the Union. Why not let South Carolina go? Who cares about South Carolina? Because if they're allowed to go, that means that the Union can be sundered just because somebody's not happy with the result of a presidential election. That concept, and it's everywhere. I was writing an essay. I'm writing an essay for Civil War Times on W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which is a landmark book that most people don't know about. And he gets Union, and he has a great section in his chapter, The General Strike, on what motivates the white population of the loyal states. And it is Union, and they come to emancipation because that is one of the tools they decide in the end that will help them keep the Union in place. I just think that idea is so overwhelming in the literature that it's amazing that anyone can pretend that it isn't there. That doesn't mean that most of the white loyal citizenry didn't eventually accept emancipation. I think they did. Even a lot of Democrats did, but not for the reasons that we would want them to. And Du Bois is really good on that too. There's not some great flowering of agonized sentiment in favor of enslaved people. It's, we got to get rid of slavery because it'll hurt the Confederacy and it'll help us, and it'll protect the Union. I think anybody who is doubtful about this should just go read Abraham Lincoln's last annual message to Congress in December 1864, where he says very explicitly, in a great fight like this, there needs to be a general goal. That goal is Union. But he said we need the 13th Amendment because that will give us one of the tools necessary to restore the Union. Now, that rhetoric is for the whole nation. He wants to keep everybody on board with the war effort. He knows that's the best way to do it. He wanted to get rid of slavery, of course, all along, but he's realistic.
And so I'm curious to follow up on that in terms of training graduate students or maybe even some undergraduate students to think about these more complex reaches of the word union in a more global sense, as how Americans saw themselves fitting into what was going on in the rest of the world. In addition to reading deeply and widely in the literature, of course, primary literature, would you recommend that graduate students need to read more about the global history of the 19th century as well, antebellum 19th century, in order to better appreciate what else was going on in the world and how Americans pictured themselves in response to what was going on, or how other nations might view America and the crisis?
Well, if they want to understand in a full way why union was important, of course they need to know something about what is going on other places, because the other places are what Americans use, and I use American. I know you're not supposed to do that anymore, but what people in the United States would use to set themselves apart. That's what we don't want to be. This is what we are, and what we are is different from what they are. It's very important to have a sense about what's going on elsewhere in the Western world. The Western world is their framework for the most place. They're aware of the republics in South America and so forth, but their economic world is basically transatlantic in terms of institutions. Their institutions didn't come from Spain. They came from England. And so that is their real framework. And when they compare themselves to those other nations, to the European nations, they see profound, fundamental differences. And one of their arguments about why union is important, Lincoln talked about this. He would say, here we are in the midst of a great civil war, and immigrants are still pouring into the United States. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they realize what we offer that no other place offers. However bad it might be, immigrants stay poor in the United States for a long time, but their estimate is that however bad it might be in the United States, it's better than it is in Donegal or some other place in Ireland or some place in Germany. They're very aware. They're much more aware of the world than most Americans now are. I mean, most Americans now probably couldn't put France in the right blank blocks on a world map. Americans paid attention to a greater degree, I think, than we do to what was going on elsewhere. And they were always aware of how they fit in vis-a-vis these other places.
Is there a risk, though, Dr. Gallagher, of a narrative that then emerges that's foundation is about union, that the war becomes too triumphant? Does that ever concern you?
You know, I hear that all the time, Peter, especially no, I'm being serious. And you hear it all the time too. Oh, that's a triumphant narrative. Well, it is sort of a triumphant narrative as far as I'm concerned. The war that both sustains a republic that does give people a voice in the government and does give them the possibility to rise and does away with the institution of slavery seems to me to have accomplished something. The aftermath is very problematical and messy, as we know very well. But we also know that absent the war, slavery would have lasted a lot longer in the United States. It was thriving. It was proving it could spread into non-cash crop applications very easily and effectively. And so the war, I mean, the secessionists, they're just spectacular miscalculators. I mean, they think they're doing something that's going to protect their institution that would have lasted decades probably, and they kill it in 4 years. There's got to be a little irony in that. So I don't see anything wrong with saying that the Civil War did yield some good things. It absolutely did. It doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of dark parts to it, but it's, I don't have a problem. So yeah, if that's being a triumphalist by saying that the outcome of the Civil War was good and the Republic was better in the summer of 1865 than it had been in April of 1861, I absolutely believe that's true. It's better in the summer of 1865 than it was in April of 1861. And it was better only because they had waged a great war.
You and I have given many tours together, and on the field, we know that the focus is on the movements of those troops. That's what people are there for. And of course, we try our best. That moment in the past in dramatic ways and compelling ways. But the monumentation that surrounds us, that often we lose sight of, I would say. And so I leap as background to your point about that people are not aware of how important Union was to Americans or to Northerners. And how can we make the battlefield a tool, in a sense, to help people remember what Northerners were fighting for? Because the preoccupation with Confederate monuments, it seems to me, has taken American attention even farther away from what Union soldiers did and what the monuments have to say.
Well, and of course, on any battlefield, the number of Confederate monuments compared to the number of Union monuments is tiny. That most of the battlefield landscapes are landscapes put in place by the winners. I have an essay in this book about using battlefields as classrooms, and I did it my whole career. You know as well as I, you both do. When you get students on a battlefield, you can have them make a connection to the past. And yes, you can talk about tactical things and questions of leadership, but you can also talk about why the armies are there and what the soldiers in them thought was at stake and how what happened on the battlefields reverberated politically and in other ways from the battlefield. What I would do, I use monuments. I'm sure you both do too. When you give your tours, I use the inscriptions on monuments. I use the iconography on monuments to make points about the different memory traditions. What I would do at Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the best place in the world to use a vast collection of outdoor sculpture to get at the different ways people remember the same event. I would love to see a serious tour geared specifically to monuments at Gettysburg that would let people get at how you can see reconciliationist sentiment, how you can see lost cause sentiment. There's not nearly as much lost cause sentiment, of course, because there are only a handful of Confederate monuments. Just the state monuments are really useful for that. The brigade markers and the battery markers, those don't have any kind of ideological cast. You can deal with Union. There are even a number of the monuments even mention the Emancipation Proclamation and slavery. So you can get at all of the major memory traditions by using the monuments on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And I don't think there's any place else in the United States that lends itself so readily to that kind of tour. I know the Park Service's resources are stretched. They're always stretched. It never gets the money it should get. But at some point, I hope that they will find the money to put specific signage up around the battlefield that deals with the memory of the war, not what happened here. We're on the edge of the peach orchard. Okay, right. There's the Klingel farm. There's, oh, yeah, that's good. But let's talk about the monuments.
Just a side note, I received an email from the chief of Interp at Antietam with a new wayside that they're putting out, and it speaks to exactly what you've mentioned. It's a sign devoted to Civil War memory, pictures of various monuments, captures the different expressions that those monuments convey. So, and I know Gettysburg is in the process of, they've completed the signs. I believe they're going to install new waysides that will also deal with the monuments. I don't know what Union monuments. I know they're giving attention to the Confederate ones.
But the Union monuments deserve, they need treatment too.
Absolutely.
Confederate monuments don't even make sense in some ways. You have to know that there are competing memories of the war that are being played out in these artistic expressions in different places. You need them both. I mean, half the story is, I guess, better than none of the story, but you really need more than that. And you can do great things with the two Maryland monuments on Culp's Hill. You can do things with the late monuments, the Delaware Monument, the Maryland Monument, the Masonic Monument in terms of reconciliation. I mean, you can do so many things at Gettysburg with the monuments, but in my view, it's crucial to tie them all together and not kind of pull one thread out and say, here's our memory tour. It's only one part of the memory.
Right. Right. No, I agree. And I am not aware of any memory tours that are currently done now. They could be out there. Certainly, I don't think the battlefield guides that they might do something in that area, but I'm not aware of anything like that. It certainly is a need.
It is a need. And I mean, just what you could do at the Eternal Light piece. I mean, just what you could do on that one site. That's always one of the main places I talk about memory at Gettysburg. There's just so much that you can do at Gettysburg in a way that you can't do it in, I don't know where. I mean, there are a lot of monuments at Chickamauga, a lot at Shiloh, a lot at Vicksburg, quite a few. I was just at Antietam a couple of weeks ago. But Antietam in no way compares to what you could do at Gettysburg. I mean, it just isn't even close.
Well, I know when I worked at Richmond National Battlefield Park, of course, people would come all the time and be astonished by how few monuments we had. It was 3 or 4 in the entire park. It was so minimal. And people would say, doesn't that, impede upon our ability to understand, history and memory? And other people would say, well, it's great that there aren't any monuments because they can, give a false history or portrayal of the history at least. And of course, both sides have their
opposed to the true history.
Right.
That true history that everybody has in their own mind what the true history is, which of course is often just as false as the ones they say are false history. I love it when what's the true? If there was we would have the Civil War book if it was that simple. Just buy the Civil War book. That has the true history of the Civil War in it, and that's all you need to read. Just read that book and everything's going to be okay. You'll sleep better at night. Everything is going to be just fine. I mean, for God's sake. I mean, the thing about history is it is unbelievably messy. And the main thing that people learn, this is something else I talk about in a number of the little essays in this book. The one thing you learn as you study and study and study is that you don't know anything. And just when you think you have a really good handle on something, you do more research and think, I almost cursed and think, darn, now I'm going to have to change my lectures again because I thought I had that down and now I don't have it down. Or you read some new book that makes you look at something in a different way. This idea of just getting the real history, the true history. What is the true history? That is elusive. It really is elusive.
Oh, let's talk about one thing in the book that I observed more than once. That Gettysburg is not the great turning point that people often make it out to be. That's undoubtedly the case. But you go a little bit farther and you suggest that, in fact, it was not the blow psychologically to the Confederate people as commonly accepted, even amongst those who say, yeah, you're right, it's not the great turning point of the war. And so clearly that's not what you initially thought about Gettysburg. How did you get there? And can you help us understand why you feel so confident about your argument about how Southerners reacted?
Well, this is a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier. That was the third day at Gettysburg was the first of the military campaigns of the Civil War series that I edited at Chapel Hill, which is groups of essays that tried to look at battles as more than just tactical. And then the 11th Alabama went here and the 20th Maine was over here. And what I assigned to myself was Confederate reaction to the battle. And when I took that, I thought, God, this is going to be so boring. I'm going to read and, Gettysburg's awful, blah, 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 blah. And then that isn't what I found. I found that there was a much more complicated reaction to Gettysburg among Confederate people. The fact that it happened in tandem with Vicksburg colored that, because Vicksburg was an unequivocal disaster for the Confederacy. They lost an army. They lost a important place on the river and so forth. But Gettysburg, the part of the battle that got the most attention was the first day. And the first day is a huge Confederate tactical success. And then eventually, of course, they realized Lee retreated. That's bad. But then they would always argue, but he wasn't driven from the field. And the Federals didn't pursue him. It was like after Antietam. It can't be an unequivocal defeat if the Union Army doesn't even pursue. They must be so damaged they can't pursue. And so there was a very, very mixed reaction to Gettysburg that contrasted very strongly with the really gloomy reaction to the loss of Vicksburg. And I think that the other measure of how little impact Gettysburg really had is that it affected not at all Lee's reputation in the Confederacy. And you see all these accounts not that long afterward talking about how Lee's never been defeated and he never will be. And you think, what? It's one of the main things quoted to prove what a disaster Gettysburg was is they go to, you can always find something in some account that will make it sound like it was a disaster. And one of the greatest Confederate diarists, of course, was their great ordnance genius. And his diary has a passage where it says that after, it seemed we were winning the war, then after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, we're tottering to our destruction. That is quoted everywhere. Well, if you read in Gorgas's diary for another 6 weeks, Gorgas says in August, Lee's army has restored all of its morale. It's made good its losses, and I think it'll probably invade the United States again. So Josiah Gorgas in August doesn't think Gettysburg was the great turning point that meant the war was, but he did have one passage where he sort of suggested that. At any rate, Peter, I went into doing that essay thinking I was going to find A. I didn't find A, so I wrote B. And I found a lot of evidence since then that I've never changed my mind on that. I just don't think Gettysburg, just as people in the North also had mixed views about Gettysburg. It wasn't wildly, great victory, great victory, great victory. It only took them a little while to decide that Meade hadn't made the greatest victory he should have out of this. And it's not just Lincoln and the letter that he never sent Meade, although he made sure Halleck let Meade know what his thoughts were. George Templeton Strong's diary does exactly the same thing. Within 2 weeks, he thinks Gettysburg's a missed opportunity, not the great turning point of the war.
And you and I, of course, go back and forth about this. And I think that what your articles in this book do is they certainly complicate that Confederate reaction. But I think the other question that comes out of these sources, and here's where we diverge a little bit in terms of how we use sources, is that my question of the sources is why did these men feel compelled to write or describe the battle, and not as a defeat, which it most certainly was, but as certainly not a loss. At worst, it's kind of almost a tie, right? We disengaged and we disengaged our own. And here's and I'll give you a piece of evidence that you've used, and that's from Stephen Dotson Ramsar, and how you would handle something like this, because it's a great challenge for all of us. And I think that is the point here, is that this evidence can be seen and interpreted from so many different angles. And Ramsar was sending a letter off to his wife, who seemed fairly disinterested in receiving letters from him, but nonetheless, he was pretty dutiful and always keeping in correspondence with her, and this letter that he wrote from the retreat. And as we know, that the army is to some degree unraveling.
Absolutely. And Ramseur admits he never even contemplated defeat, never even thought about it.
Well, but that's the point then. How do we then explain Ramseur when he is in the midst of everything falling apart around him, but he makes the calculated decision as a writer to tell his wife that none of this is happening? But you and
he doesn't tell her that. He's clearly disappointed. He doesn't tell her that at all. To me, the important thing is not how does Ramseur feel. I mean, that's perfectly natural that people would try to put as positive a possible gloss on something awful that happened. That often happens. To me, the real test is, what is Ramseur saying 3 months later, 4 months later, 5 months later? And what he's saying then is, he doesn't give up on the Confederacy because of Gettysburg. He doesn't think Gettysburg is the end of the road for the Confederacy. And I'm not just talking about soldier letters. Women's diaries are great sources on these things. And to track how women behind the lines view events as they get a little bit farther away from them is very useful as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
So also getting back to some of the issues that arise when people come to Gettysburg for the first time and they look out at Pickett's charge, the field, and they say, this is madness. Why would Lee do this? This was, suicidal. Some of those people might also say, Lee was foolish in the first place to cross the border, to come up into Pennsylvania. All he had to do was keep on the defensive and string out the war long enough to kill Northern support for the war effort and Northern morale, and certainly affect the political scene back in the North. But one of the interesting things that you bring up in your work, and particularly in the enduring Civil War, is how important Confederate morale and Confederate perceptions of offensive campaigns. Those offensive campaigns directly impact the morale back at home for the Confederacy. And so the fact that Lee, came into Pennsylvania, even the fact that he didn't win, that he had this terrible defeat, that he needed to keep pressing those offensives in some respect just to keep Confederate morale up. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of balancing, infusing the political situation in the home front, perception of what's going on in the battlefield, with a tour for a family who would come and, look at that Pickett's charge field and say, just suicide, just murder. It could have been avoided and it was stupid.
Well, it's hard to dress up the third day at Gettysburg. I think that Lee, that shows Lee at his aggressive worst, I think. The Pickett-Pettigrew assault on the third day at Gettysburg. I mean, the first day, he didn't plan it. It went well. I think it probably made some sense for him to try to continue the tactical offensive on the second day, although I'm with Porter Alexander here. You had a great first day, hunker down on Seminary Hill and let the Yankees attack you. How successful have Yankees been in attacking the Army in Northern Virginia over the history of the Army? But Lee's aggressive. I mean, Lee didn't go north with the idea of fighting a battle or waging a campaign where he loses a third of his general officers as casualties and 25,000 of his men. He wanted was a logistical campaign for the most part for him. I think he anticipated probably the likelihood of some kind of battle at some point on his terms. That isn't what he got in the end. But it isn't just a campaign going north to look for a giant fight and a giant bloodletting, which is how some people address it. I think, and Peter and I have talked about the question of what Confederate people expected a great deal. And I think he's right. I argue in the Confederate War that they didn't want your armies to just sit there and let the Yankees come after them. And not only did bad things often happen when you did that, but they wanted a sense of smiting the enemy. I think that was more prevalent in the first couple of years of the war than it was later in the war. But there is an expectation that if you just sit, and Lee really believed this. He talked about it just after Chancellorsville. He said, well, I can sit here. If I sit here, they will get their much bigger army. They will pick their place and they will come after us again. And if we keep doing that, it will end up as a siege. If it ends up as a siege, it will only end one way. And he was, of course, absolutely right about that. That's in the end what happened. Right. When Grant came, it did end up in a siege. Vicksburg ended up in a siege. Sieges aren't good. Atlanta was sort of besieged. I mean, those things don't end well for the Confederacy. And Lee believed that by maintaining an operational initiative, he could at least force the opponent to respond to what he's doing rather than just sit and wait while his much smaller army allows a much larger army of the Potomac to invest it in some way, somewhere, when it circumscribes his options. So he also had a very good sense, and I'll stop. This will be enough of this. It's already 1:15. He had a good sense of the impact of his operations on morale in the United States. And he understood. I mean, he read Northern newspapers assiduously. They all read each other's newspapers. He knew that what he did affected Northern morale in important ways. And putting the most famous and important Confederate army into Pennsylvania is very bad news for the Lincoln administration. That is not good news for Republicans to have the biggest rebel army in the United States. He understood that. That's very different than having the Army in Northern Virginia on the Rappahannock River line and the Army of the Potomac picking another place and time to launch another offensive against them.
And so just to quickly follow up on that, Lee's offensive then at Malvern Hill, I guess, could be criticized.
It's inexplicable.
Right.
We've all been to Malvern Hill. You
right.
couldn't pick a better. What's really inexplicable there is why little Jorge decided that he'd abandon a position that was so powerful that the Confederates had no chance of driving Union troops off of it. That's what's inexplicable at Malvern Hill, even more inexplicable than the Confederate attacks.
But that wasn't fault entirely at Malvern Hill. He was coming back. He never really initiated the fight. It sort of started on its own. I think Venable might have been responsible for that. I mean, ultimately, it's certainly is Lee's army. But, I mean, what happened at Malvern Hill was not, I think, at all similar to what happened at Pickett's Charge, where Lee's clearly behind it. He's orchestrating it.
Yeah. I mean, I thought we were going to get McClellan off the hook there, and I was worried, Peter, because I would put up a serious resistance.
There's not much of a way of defending McClellan.
We've had a smashing victory. Let's retreat to Harrison's Landing right now.
yes. And go to swamp-infested areas along the James River, and then just watch your army just sort of. Yeah, it's beautiful. As I told my students today, that the one great thing that you should learn from George B. McClellan is that if you send off emails that are obnoxious to your girlfriend or to your wife or husband or boyfriend, that's perfectly fine, right? But just make sure that that person throws it all in the delete button, right, in the little waste paper basket. Ellen needed to get that message. Put him in the fireplace, right?
And of course, whenever we send anything, there's no way to control what the person who receives it does with it.
I'm going to make a slight defense of George B. McClellan, and it's a very good piece. It was in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography by the author who wrote "Shook Over Hell." His name is eluding me.
Dean?
Yeah, that's right. Dean is a Dean even. Yeah. He wrote a piece, and I think you're even cited in it, Dr. Gallagher. He made the point that the expectations that were placed on McClellan and the Army of the Potomac were, of course, then extends that argument to suggest, and I think he's correct, that we, of course, imagine the possibilities that McClellan could have achieved if he would have fought something along the lines of what U.S. Grant would have done. But U.S. Grant, of course, would not have fought the way he did in 1862 and 1864, right? So my point is that to think that McClellan in 62 could have fought with unbridled aggressiveness, and that the casualties, of course, would have been much higher, that the Northern people would not have stood for that, nor would the Lincoln administration. I believe even Grant wrote in his memoirs, not a defense of McClellan, but a recognition that we were all learning at that early stage of the war. And unfortunately for McClellan, he had Washington looking over his shoulder the entire time.
That's all true. And I think McClellan had real talents. And I think his attitudes toward Union were in line with the vast majority of the loyal citizenry. He forged an incredible bond with his soldiers, but I simply cannot. It doesn't. You're not asking something extraordinary from a commander at Antietam when The Confederate defense in the sunken road collapses. He has just exactly what he pretends he wanted to have. He has an entire corps that hasn't fired its muskets, basically, and he does nothing. I think it's hard to explain that away. And to come back to Malvern Hill, I think it's hard to explain away abandoning the field of a great victory on July 1st, 1862, and retreating from that. To me, I think McClellan was very good at a number of things, but he wasn't good when the moment of truth came on a battlefield, and he simply didn't.
But he was remarkable. In the days following Malvern Hill, he had his own printing press, and he started putting out the proclamations.
No,
Of course, the great victory. My point being, again, is it's truly remarkable that he was able to attain the loyalty of the men in the Army of the Potomac, but he did it in part by making it clear to them that the opposition was not just the rebels, but it was forces in Washington, D.C.
Oh, no, I know. Dark forces.
But it was, again, these conspiratorial forces that were against the Army. And in that way, he was able, I think, and other reasons as well, but able to forge that bond. I want to go back to actually Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the enduring Civil War is you have a number of chapters on historians, for a variety of reasons, are not read as they once were. And you single out Douglas Southall Freeman. So I'm going to just make an argument here and would like for you to respond. And that is that Freeman, without question, wrote beautifully, received a Pulitzer Prize for R.E. Lee, wrote 3 volumes on Lee's Army, Lee's lieutenants. But we'll just focus on Lee's lieutenants. For all the value of that book, the original research, these really incisive, thoughtful analysis of various secondary generals in the A and B. Nonetheless, one cannot read this book without feeling the corrupting influence of lost cause romanticism. Why, in God's name, should we be reading Freeman? Because in the end of the day, one might argue the book is tainted by the lost cause.
Well, I would say that we could approach books as adults who are able to understand that Freeman was the son of a Confederate veteran and idolized Robert E. Lee and was fully on board with much of the lost cause take on the Civil War, but nonetheless did a great deal of research, understood the command of the Army of Northern Virginia extremely well, and conveyed a great deal of very useful information in an effective narrative way in these books. It seems to me that we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. People could still learn a great deal from Lee's lieutenants, and R.E. Lee is worse than Lee's. The Pulitzer Prize winning biography is more lost cause-ish than Lee's lieutenants. I think Lee's lieutenants is better on the whole, but absolutely. In the little essay I wrote in here about Freeman, in the book about Freeman, I say the lost cause aroma hangs over Lee's lieutenants. But I don't think that means there's no value in Lee's lieutenants anymore. I mean, books are generally of their time, and his certainly is there. But I don't think I think if you're aware of the lost cause bias, it lets you kind of filter it out as you go through, and then you can take what's useful from the books. He has an amazing discussion of the military geography of Virginia in those books. Just amazing. Better than anything I've seen anywhere else. He has it as an appendix and he lays out the different areas and the rivers and the railroads and the towns. It's just, there's nothing else like it that I'm aware of. Freeman knew a great deal, and there's a lot of it, and a lot of it is still worth reading in Lee's lieutenants, even though the lost cause that is a problem. But it's as long, in my view, as long as you know it's a problem, then you can still pull a lot of useful material out of Lee's lieutenants.
And we had a similar discussion when we were talking with Michael Gora about, is Faulkner still relevant and important to read? And some people dismissing it entirely or being heavily wary about including that in the canon. But
I don't think it's going to be long before Faulkner is no longer taught. He's kind of a bridge too far, I think.
Yeah, well, to me, it's a terrible. It would be a tragedy to take him out of the canon just because of the
Huckleberry Finn is not taught lots of. Huckleberry Finn is prescribed in many. I taught a graduate course a few years ago, half the students in the graduate course had gone to schools where Huckleberry Finn had been taken out of the school library.
Sure. Yeah. And it's a shame because it's hobbling us. And I think we can read these books as adults and take them for what they are. And of course, Faulkner, having the ambivalent and at times abhorrent views about race compared to our contemporary views. People are offended by that, but in other ways, he was much more moderate on racial views than other people of his time, and certainly understanding where he came from is important. But just unpacking the complexities that he was able to observe about the post-war South and the haunting, kind of tempting, but also haunting and abhorrent facets of the South, we'd be losing a great deal if we were just writing him off because we were offended.
Well, I think Faulkner understood. I think he had lots to say about the South that is well worth reading. There are many students, of course, who would be thrilled to have Faulkner removed from the canon because you can't watch Faulkner while you're also watching something on television. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. He's a serious. It's a pull to read Faulkner.
Sure.
All consuming. So, and speaking about,
but we have to keep Intruder in the Duster. We can't quote Faulkner endlessly about how it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end. It's 1 o'clock. Anything's possible. I mean, we've got to keep that at least.
Right.
So, Dr. Gallagher, in reading this collection of essays published in Civil War times, you cover so much ground. And the word historiography, I don't think appears at all, nor should it. We're dealing with popular audiences, and that's a good thing. I mean, when you read this, it's hard to know, as a field, where do we go? And you can speak about academics in terms of either questions or issues. I'm sorry about that. Where do you think we should go? And you can also talk about public history as well, if you think that there's possibilities and opportunities that could be fulfilled and that have not been. I'm eager to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I've got a minute and 13 seconds, so I can't really do very much with that. It's the field. The thing about the field of Civil War history is that, in my view, it's like Emerson's Oversoul. It is infinitely expandable. It can embrace almost anything. It's changed so radically in my lifetime, from a field that was mainly high politics and military affairs and a little bit of diplomatic and economic history. That was basically the field. And now the field, beginning in the 70s, but through the 80s and 90s, is just expanding. Memory didn't exist. Memory studies didn't exist when I was young. There was almost nothing on gender. The only books on the common soldiers when I started reading about the Civil War, literally, were Bell Wiley's 2 books. I mean, that was it. You could read Hardtack and Coffee. You could read detailed minutiae of soldier life. You could read Carlton McCarthy on Confederates, and you could read Hardtack and Coffee on Federals, and you could read Bell Wiley. That was the common soldier literature. I mean, we're in a completely different world now, a completely different world. People knew about Mary Chestnut. I have an entire bookcase of women's accounts in my library. Now, they're overwhelmingly Confederate. That's one thing we could do. We could have a lot more on women in the loyal states than we have now. The Confederates have gotten way more attention, and especially, of course, slaveholding Confederate women have gotten more attention. I mean, but the war in the world, the war in the West, the war. I mean, it's been expanded in so many ways. I have no idea where it will go in the future. That's one of the interesting things about it. Nobody sits down and says, well, in 1988, no one sat down and said that the next, there's going to be a big memory wave now, a lot of memory stuff. Nobody said that. It unfolds organically, and people need to find new things to write about always. But I think there's a danger in this too. I think to use Walt Whitman, I used Walt Whitman in my introduction, the idea that the real war will never get in the books. Whitman was talking specifically about the war that Union soldiers knew. That's what he's talking about there. It's used more broadly now. I think a lot of the real war not only is in the books now, it's been in the books for a long time. And to come back to our earlier point, that's why it's important to read books written a long time ago, not just books that are written now. We're going to always know more about what happened during the Civil War, but we know a very great deal about what happened already. And we knew it even when I was young reading about it. Peter, we have 3 generations of people here who've come to the war and are very interested in it. And for each one of us, when we were young reading about it, there was a great deal that we already knew. We know more now, and we'll know more going forward. And that's why it's a field, it doesn't get stale. It just doesn't. There's always something else to do with the Civil War because the people are so interesting, the issues are so important. There's so much testimony. I mean, the amount of it's overwhelming.
Although, of course, you mentioned in your book, which I agree with, there's also a danger of being so on the hunt for something brand new and innovative that's going to dramatically shift the field and can overemphasize certain topics or say that certain topics are representative or the final word and there's nothing else to be said on that topic, or you have found the niche that no one else has unpacked ever before that is somehow most important for the scholarship. So that's, of course, the other danger which you speak to in your book.
And I do think that's a danger. And of course, that brands me instantly as a hopeless old fogey who just doesn't get what's going on. But anyway, I think that there is a danger of that. I'm not against writing about anything. I want people to write about everything. There's not a single aspect of the Civil War that I would say, oh, don't write about that. Write about everything. Just when you write about it, keep some sense of proportion in terms of how your findings fit in with the larger mosaic of what we know.
Sure.
That falls under the category of stunningly obvious things to recommend.
But I mean, that is, again, the mosaic is pretty much in place, you would say. And there's just not a lot of room of maneuvering, especially for, I would say, the kinds of books that would change the field in a dramatic way. The contours are in place. And I think
it's hard to really, I think that kind of book, Peter, is very hard to write. Now, to change the field in any kind of structural way, I think that's doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's hard to do.
Right. I mean, whether it's the coming of the war itself, questions of nationalism, the military history aspects of it. I mean, we're left with drilling down, which of course then leaves us vulnerable to the frequent charge that we just deal in minutia. But I'm not certain, again, I don't think that's fair, but I understand where it comes from because there's been so much work done and such good work that's been done. There doesn't seem to be a lot of wiggle room. And of course, as you both point out, there are some examples in which to make that new claim, that people have maybe exaggerated the significance or importance of what they're doing or have lost sight of the important things. Again, I'm wilting in on Appomattox here. I'd like for you, Dr. Gallagher, just to tell us again why you feel so strongly that we need to take note and recognize the significance of Lee's surrender at Appomattox and the Confederate forces that followed suit all the way through May and then to early June of 1865. Why is that so important, and why are you concerned that we might lose sight of the significance of that?
I think it's important because the whole notion of a long Civil War I find somewhat problematical, because I think it's possible to stretch the Civil War so much that the war itself only becomes sort of one incident in a series of incidents that in some ways hasn't, I mean, we see how the Civil War still plays out now in some ways. I think people at the time viewed Appomattox as the end of the war, and I think they did so for very important reasons. One is it gets the main national institution off the board for the Confederacy. The Army of Northern Virginia is gone. How many Confederates thought, and Jefferson Davis will put him over in a kind of demented group, who thought that maybe there was still some chance for something to happen? Almost nobody thought there was a chance for anything to happen. Lee's gone. The Army of Northern Virginia's gone. That's it. We had a good shot. It's over with. I think the war ended. And some of the things that suggest that to me are that the Confederacy ceased to exist. Slavery ceased to exist. A million United States soldiers who were under arms in May of 1865, 80% of them were home by the end of the year. There were 11,000 of them left the following spring. These suggest to me the end of a war. And now that doesn't mean that there aren't, of course, long-term ramifications. And it doesn't mean there's a kind of low grade of violence that continues in the former Confederate States for a long time. But it's not a continuation of the war by other means. The scale is so vastly different. And what is possible is so vastly different. The former Confederates aren't going to establish a modern nation state built on slavery. They are going to try to find a way to perpetuate white supremacy. So that's a mightily scaled back goal there. And they're doing that within a U.S. framework where most white people everywhere believe in white supremacy. That isn't just, it's just that black people live in the former Confederacy. I just think that to pretend that the war doesn't really end in the summer of 1865 overlooks very powerful factors that suggest it did. I mean, it's really no more complicated than that.
It supports the unfortunate trope that the Civil War is just a great tragedy. And
no, of course.
Just and then from that point, some people would say then a great tragedy just between Americans. So it's an unintended consequence, I think, of those who argue that we have to continue to think of the war as a continuation after Appomattox. And I think what they don't realize is, especially for students and for people who are Civil War buffs, that they then start to lose sense of what you have, I think, described in this book is the revolutionary consequences of this war. And whether you think it's triumphant or not, the change is radical. And that's undeniable. But you lose sense of that.
Try to imagine, I mean, there would be no 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment without the Civil. That's pretty, I mean, and the fact that Reconstruction yields the 14th and 15th Amendments has to be taken as pretty powerful evidence that Reconstruction wasn't some kind of complete failure. It wasn't a complete failure. And of course there was no, and anyway, we don't have time to do this. That could be subject for another talk. I mean, if you understand, I'm going to come back to Union with one more thing. If you understand how important Union is, Reconstruction makes a lot more sense. If you understand that the vast majority of white people wanted to restore the Union, get rid of slavery because it was a threat to Union going forward, though, check, those are done. Most of them didn't say, and then our third great goal is real equality for black people. No, that wasn't a third great goal for most of white America. And if you understand that, Reconstruction isn't mysterious. They're not going to pay for a long-term army of occupation big enough to do anything. And it's not going to do it. Not going to happen.
Well, it harkens back too to something that I heard John Kosky say a long time ago, which is, that the iconic handshake over the stone wall at Pickett's charge there.
We don't know what they were saying to each other, do we? You son of a bitch. I wish I had more. Right. I mean, that's what we don't have. We don't have the transcripts of what they were saying.
Right. Which, of course, the first one is spontaneous, and then they reenact that, in successive years. And
Take three.
It's gone from going kind of from one end of the pendulum of being like, oh, this shows everything was tied up in a neat little bow and everyone had forgotten the causes of the war. That was the old school interpretation. To now people are disgusted by that, saying that completely obscures, so many of the racial antagonisms, the sectional fighting that's still going on. But as John Kosky, I think quite nicely reminds us, it's amazing, really, that in such a short period of time, we could go from a war that killed 2% of the American population to an episode in which the two sides are shaking hands over a stone wall, despite everything else that's going on behind the scenes and the imperfect union that was formed. The fact that after a civil war, that union could exist in that relatively short period of time is remarkable, and something that we can't lose sight of in our disgust or disapproval of how imperfect Reconstruction might be in our current standards. It was a remarkable thing, especially when comparing it again globally to other countries who've endured civil wars that have taken much, much longer.
That's true. And it didn't kill 2% of the white Southern population. It killed between 4 and 5% of them, more than any of the great powers in World War I. That's what we always use as the standard of slaughter. It's higher than that. So anyway, everything's more complicated. Every single thing is more complicated about the Civil War than we think it is.
So again, Ashley, I think that's such an important observation, because and I'm on charge now to mention to people that this killing ground became a ground of reconciliation, and just to pose the question that we all believe that reconciliation is needed and important, but can you have reconciliation and also have social justice? And again, that's a question for everyone to think about, I think, in a very individual way. But it's an important one. It's a critical one. And if we continue to simply reduce historical actors on both sides to really sort of one-dimensional figures, now every Confederate is just fighting for a slave-holding republic, and we have Union soldiers who I guess don't really know why they're fighting. We are losing so much when we are engaging our public audiences to be able to understand, as Ashley, again, as you said so nicely, the lasting impact and legacy of Gettysburg. To go back to the reunion, our last anecdote, Jill Titus told me this, that in 1913, there was a knife fight that broke out between Union and Confederate veterans at the Gettysburg Hotel after a Confederate veteran said some disparaging remarks about Abraham Lincoln. So there you have it.
Surprise.
Not a surprise, exactly. Dr. Gallagher, thank you so much. Dr. Gallagher will not, also, you won't be surprised by this. Here's his book, Without the Dust Jacket. Now, what you'll be surprised by is I've taken the dust jacket off so that it is well preserved and protected. It's going to get a plastic sheet. We have a long history and a very different memory of it, and there it is with the dust jacket. But Ashley's does not have the plastic sheet, by the way. Well, right. Dr. Gallagher, over the many years that we have been friends and that I was a student, he has encountered times where I've been a little rough with books, but I've made some improvements.
My heart is soaring, Peter, and I just think it's great that you're going to put a Mylar cover on that. I'm thrilled that LSU's giving a 40% discount. I can't. They didn't do that for anybody else on one of these podcasts. I don't.
That's right. We have the 40% discount, and I just typed in the comments the discount code, the 04 read home in all caps. So for those of you who have yet to purchase and are feeling intrigued by today's conversation, please follow the discount code, and you too can receive 40% off for Gary's new book.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Gary.
Thank you. Ashley, who do we have next week?
Next week, we're mixing it up a little bit. We're going back to our public historians. We have Michelle Crowell from the Library of Congress, who will be talking about a couple of their kind of hidden gems from the collection at the Library of Congress. So discussion about kind of behind the scenes work in the archives and what we can take from those sources that she'll be sharing with us.
Good. Fantastic. All right. Thank you, Ashley. We'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher.
Bye-bye.